Hi, everyone. We're back for another conversation with an autoheterosexual person. And today I'm here with Hunter, who is an autogynephilic male to male detransitioner and someone that prioritizes truth. And that's something I value in him. And yeah, thanks for coming on the channel today, Hunter.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I feel very, similarly about your work. Loved your book, and it's good to see someone speaking clearly and in an evidenced fashion on these issues. Definitely could have saved me a lot of trouble if I'd encountered these ideas sooner.
Yeah. Um, I think, yeah, I'll be curious. I'll ask at some point probably like how that affected your desire to stay transition. But I think chronologically, I'm probably gonna wonder like just about your early life first. Like what are some of the first signs of what you now understand to be autogynephilia that you experienced when you were younger?
Yeah, so I would say that uh, around puberty, right, I started noticing that I was attracted to like the idea of feminization, or in particular, like taking on a stereotypically feminine role in the context of sex, but I wasn't attracted to men at all, right? And that was, at the time, I had just categorized this as like, that's a weird kink, and like, it's, people have those. It's no big deal. I thought it was, like maybe like slightly embarrassing, like a lot of kinks, but I didn't really put a ton of thought into it beyond that. And then let's see, other things are that from pretty early age, like 15 or 16, I always wore my hair long. I hated getting it cut. I didn't know why. I just, every time I got it cut really short, I felt like weird and bad. And yeah, I never felt much affinity for sort of stereotypically masculine things. It's some, I mean, so, like typical, like kind of maybe autistic, uh, autogynephile things, but like I liked construction toys, and I like math, those kinds of things. But beyond that, I was never into sports really. I didn't feel drawn to like try to be very masculine, so it's a thing that it's pretty normal for boys who are entering puberty to want to sort of define themselves as men and like really play up to and inhabit that role, and like that didn't really happen for me. I always found it kind of vaguely distasteful, and yeah, I didn't really know why. And then yeah, I at the time, um I grew up in Oklahoma, and it's not like I went to like a super redneck school or anything, but I had barely heard of transgenderism or anything like this, right? Like maybe I had once, seen something on a talk show in a waiting room, but I didn't think of it as like anything that could ever apply to me, and it didn't really occupy any amount of space in my head. I didn't know anybody who there was like one openly gay kid at my school, but nobody who expressed any kind of like gender feelings or anything. So that didn't I didn't process these desires as identity issues until around age 26, when I encountered the infamous like egg IRL subreddit, right?
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, I feel a lot of these things this much. And this was the only time I'd really seen people talking about these experiences that I'd had in a way that it matched how I felt, right? So I just, maybe naturally, maybe naively, I just sort of assumed that they also had the correct interpretation of these things, which is that, I have an inner female spirit or something. And that kind of set me down that path.
Yeah, and that's interesting that the Reddit played a role in sort of sending you down that path. It's something I complain about all the time on Twitter, as you probably see, that like basically Reddit pink pills autogynephiles, and 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 pro and it's prohibited to actually tell someone if they're questioning on there whether like, hey man, sounds like what you're describing is typical autogynephilia, and it's fine to
Mhm.
transition, but like you should know that, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that I think that would have I would have at least liked to have that information. And like
Yeah,
it's such a, again, like, I think people like being seen. And if you can get past when that can be a little uncomfortable or, unflattering in a certain lens or something, there's no reason it really should be. But then that's a really pleasant experience, right? To have your experiences accurately sort of mirrored back at you is like it's incredibly valuable, and it's a shame that we keep that away from people and sort of hold up a distorted mirror to what they're feeling.
right. Yeah. And once you encountered that sort of thinking, like the egg IRL stuff, and then started thinking about transgenderism, like what path did you go down?
So very, very quickly, right, within like a week probably of just learning any of these terms, right? Learning like what is HRT, what is dysphoria, right? These were not words I'd ever heard before. But yeah, within about a week, I had made an appointment at Planned Parenthood for hormones, right? Which I started immediately. It's the informed consent model. So you just walk in and they're like, this is what these are going to do. How do you feel about that? And I'm like, sounds great. I don't like being, like hairy, softer skin sounds good, like fat redistribution. That all sounds like stuff I want. So I started that pretty much immediately. And then began presenting pretty much full time shortly after that. This would have been, gosh, when was this? This would have been in fall of 2019.
Yeah, that was just like a few months after I first learned about autogynephilia. I
Oh,
was
really? Mm.
Yeah, at that time I was in the background reading a bunch of papers.
Oh,
Yeah,
nice. Yeah, that's what I
yeah.
should have been doing instead of reading Reddit posts.
Well, you know, y talking about this openly may help other people avoid the same path.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big part of why I'm here for sure. But yeah, so I was in a relationship at the time I was married to a woman who identified as non-binary, and she was very supportive of this and very encouraging, and even kind of like drew me forward a little bit. I would say things like, I don't really know about identity. I don't know what I feel like inside, right? I just want these physiological changes. And, she really kind of encouraged is a gentle word,
Like
the
cheerleaded?
yeah, the identification kind of, right? Is like that you
Yeah.
want these things because you're a woman and I've always known, right? I knew the whole time it was like, okay, I guess, this is the person that I'm like closest to, and she seems very certain. And, I'm not trying to absolve myself of responsibility or anything, but just historically, that is what happened. So, yeah, I mean, so I transitioned, did that, I wore dresses to my job at the time. Whole thing, kept, participating in the community, right? Read a lot of posts, wrote a lot of posts. And I didn't really know anyone then in real life who was also like medically trans, right? I knew a lot of people who, used they, them pronouns or, had various other, sort of quirky identity things. But nobody who was like taking medical steps. That did not become a big part of my life until my second marriage to another woman who identified as non-binary. I guess I have a type. But
Yeah.
but yeah, when I was with her, right, we were polyamorous and we were in Oklahoma City, and the LGBT community, especially sort of the poly trans community there, as you might imagine, is not huge, and so it's very tight knit. And uh, we were in that a lot, both through dating and friendships and all kinds of things. And that's when I first had a lot of exposure to other trans people, both MTF and FTM, and that kind of started to change my perspectives on some things.
Yeah. How do you think that either of your wives were autoandrophilic, or like what do you think the cause of their non-binary identification was?
So I, these are, I don't want to psychologize them too much, or
Okay.
and I definitely don't want to speak ill of them,
All right.
but
Well, yeah,
I
you
think
don't have to answer that if you don't want.
no, there's some things I can say. It's just a little bit of throat clearing, before I do. But uh, I don't know, in the case of wife number one, exactly what the cause of this uh, of her non-binary identification was. In the case of wife number two, I think that there may have been some of that. Yeah, yeah. She did sometimes express, um, excitement at the idea, at like certain aspects of maleness, maybe in certain ways, but inconsistently. Also, sometimes expressed interest in aspects of femaleness. So yeah, hard to say, but possibly, especially with my second wife. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Um, how like what made you start to second guess like the decision to transition? Because like you were fully transitioned, like you'd even had like a boob job, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I had FFS, facial feminization surgery, and had breast implants put in at the same time. I've had the implants removed since, but yeah, I that happened during the second marriage. But probably a lot of what started to chip away at it was being exposed more to the community in real life, right? So in a few different ways. So one of them was that I knew people sort of at every stage of their transition, right? I knew people who had just come out, people who were thinking about coming out, people who had been out for years, people who were stealth at work, all kinds of stuff. And what I saw throughout this process was, among other things, like no huge improvement in mental health, right? Like most of these people were pretty mentally ill. By their own admission, they were happy to talk about it. They a lot of them were getting psychiatric or therapeutic treatments, and I didn't really notice anybody get way happier, right, as they transitioned, right? They sort of their it seemed to more provide like a center of gravity for the neurosis to orbit around rather than actually ameliorating it. And just so few of these people were really like deeply functional as people. And obviously this is anecdotal, right? This isn't like an even sample, but like we know that rates of mental illness in the trans population are extremely high, right? Both,
Yeah.
both before and after transition. So that was one thing. But the sharper thing to me, um, was just noticing that, in particular, none of the like male to female trans people I knew felt behaviorally female to me, right? They didn't like in just like, obviously I knew they weren't like biologically female or something, but I was working under the, sort of a brain sex assumption, basically, that like these are people who are just sort of um sort of innately psychologically more in the female cluster or something. And
Right.
I
So it's
just
like why are they
yeah.
behaving that way? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this like explaining why I'm so sensitive to this probably requires talking about some unfortunate things in my childhood. But when I was very, very young, from ages 2 to 4, I was sexually abused, and there were several other incidents of abuse from different sources throughout my early life until I hit until around when I hit puberty. And I think this in addition to the autogynephilia, I think this is another sort of impetus for my transition, because I had a sort of aversion to and distrust of men as a result of these experiences. And I always just felt,
Right.
safer and more comfortable around women. And that was, and generally women were very happy to be friends with me. I feel like I got a lot of sort of like gay best friend treatment, even though I was not gay. And that was something I really enjoyed, right? Like I really liked hanging out with like groups of women because it was like it's soft and comfortable, and like there are different social norms, and it was just something that like I treasured, right? And I
Yeah, it's
think
pretty great.
yeah, it's lovely, right?
Yeah.
Like women are great. I love women, right? And
Yeah, I
like
love them too.
yeah, they're fantastic. And like I think I sort of in the back of my mind, I was sort of feeling like, oh, like I am escaping from, the sort of the male clubhouse that I don't like at all. And I'm, now an honorary member of the female clubhouse or whatever. But I sort of saw that like the same like, movement or ideology or cultural shift or whatever that enabled me to do this had essentially left the door open, right? And I got like the same sort of like scary, icky, predatory feelings from a ton of male to female transsexual people that I got from just normal men, right? And I like that was enough for me that like my like cultural and like ideological programming was not enough to make me ignore that, because it's just this like very deep visceral thing in me. And so seeing a lot of the exact same sort of like creepy, entitled, like sexually aggressive behavior that's like not atypical for men generally, but just seeing like exactly those same behaviors among people who, sort of want into the clubhouse. And I was like, this can't be okay, right? There's something is wrong with this system, because like there are real good reasons why, like I think like a feminism was for me. I don't really consider myself a feminist now, but like, a pro woman attitude was very much entangled with my transition, and, like a sensitivity to women's concerns and to their safety, right? And just to the danger that men pose. And of course, this was only amplified by my experiences, right? Like for about, maybe a year and a half of my like the 5 years that I was transitioned, I passed reasonably well. And so did experience, a lot of those same fears that had been gone, since I hit puberty. And so it was enough to make me start thinking like, okay, like at minimum, self ID is not good enough, right? Like there's like there are real legitimate safety concerns here, and they're all just being hand waved away. And I was also not comfortable with like the total like social constructivist attitude that like the only reason why men can be dangerous to women is because they're trained to do so by society or something. Like it just seemed just facially obvious to me that there's an innate component here, right? This probably has something to do with neurology and hormones, but not just current hormone level, history of hormone levels, right? I was like, there's a real risk here. And like our fear of offending people is leading us to tolerate like actual physical harm, right? And that just seems so wrong to me. Like it should never be the case that like feelings of offense override like stuff happening to people's bodies that they don't want to happen to them, right? And there were like
Right.
incidents of assault in sort of our segment of the community that were really just not dealt with appropriately. And there was no acknowledgement that like that this was this is male typical behavior, right? This is not something that like I've ever experienced from women or women doing or anything. I'm not saying it never happens, but there was just this like this willful blindness to what I felt were very urgent concerns. And that did start to make me question things, make me willing to sort of go against the trans orthodoxy a little bit.
Yeah. It sounds like you took the gynephilia part of autogynephilia seriously. And
Yeah.
it's sort of how I think of that. Like I feel similarly that like I care about women and I don't want them to be harmed by um male gynephilia, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And like that's really the root of so much of it for me, is that like I just really, really love women. And that's why like the autohet model makes so much sense to me personally, is because like when I really deeply learned what that was, it was just like, oh yeah, like obviously like that's what's going on, is that like I, kind of don't like men in general for the reasons I discussed, and I really love women, right? For both like non-romantic and romantic reasons. And so I felt like maybe I could love myself more if I was one, and that I wouldn't feel this this ego dissonance of sort of being a thing that I like, being a member of a category that in general I was not a huge fan of. So yeah, and then when that was not at all operating for other male to female transsexuals, right? They ever talked about were their own concerns as a class, right? Like male to female issues. They never just talked about like female issues, and like
Right. Yeah.
every aspect of their political thought and their their activism and their agitating for things was all about their own rights, like overriding women's concerns and fears and sense of safety. And there was none of this thing that I saw in myself. There was none of this like true love of women, this true philia for women. And it was just really off-putting.
Yeah. I wish more transsexuals had that sort of like holistic love of women that you're describing. And yeah, I feel similarly that women are great, and I think that transsexualism is possible, but there needs to be some sort. It can't just be as simple as the trans movement makes it out to be in terms of integration, like the
Yeah,
self ID
absolutely.
thing.
Yeah, integration is a really great way to put it, because yeah, I for me it did feel like sort of an immigrant experience, right? Like I'm immigrating to a different sex class, right? And I was all, I'm sure that if I could play the tape backwards, there would have been moments when I was cringy or, did things that, I would have found, sort of entitled or objectionable now. But most of the time, I felt very sort of humbled by the acceptance that I received, right? I was like, oh, wow, like, it's thank you so much for including me. This is incredibly sweet. And I'm going to be like extra super careful to make sure that I, make you happy that you made that decision. You know what I mean? And like,
Yeah, yeah. To not take it for granted.
yeah, exactly. I didn't really feel like it was something I was owed, right? I felt like it was a very sweet thing that women were doing for me by including me. Kind of, the way that they really had, a lot of my life. And I always just didn't want to be gross about it. And in the same way that, if I travel to a foreign country, right, I don't want to be like boorish and off-putting and like just trample all over aspects of their culture or whatever. Like I try my best to like know what I don't know and to learn and to to fit in as best I can and to be kind of unobtrusive. And I think that if that was the median attitude of male to female transsexuals, we would have, this would just be less of a political issue across the board. I don't think people would even think about it as much one way or the other.
Right. Yeah. If the self-policing was being done adequately, then much of the issues wouldn't be happening.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the critical aspect of self-policing that's missing is a willingness to acknowledge that a lot of these misbehaviors are very much sex typed, right? And
Right. And that they apply to the self.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, right. And like people will, occasionally like, even this is like way too much like pulling teeth sometimes, but like people will occasionally acknowledge like this particular, trans person, like Chris Tyson or something, is a bad actor, right? But they don't acknowledge that like they're a bad actor in like very like male coded ways, and that should not surprise us, right? This isn't like weird or
Right.
confusing that this would be the case, right? And like, yeah, I think that like because that threatens like the like sanctity and absoluteness of the identity, that it's not allowed. And if we could all just be more realistic and be like, yeah, like we are male people, but for, you know, various psychological reasons, we feel we fit in better in this tribe, and we're going to do our best to fit in, right? But if you know, the insistence on like, you know, we are women in some like absolute immutable sense that can't be revoked or taken away, or, you know, it's like that's why they sort of can't do the policing, right? Because to do the
Right.
policing correctly would be to admit that their frame for these issues is not accurate.
Yeah. And it goes up against the psychopathology of the condition.
Right. Yeah,
That
it's very
yeah.
unflattering, right? You're, you know, the last thing, and you know, I feel this very deeply in myself for a whole suite of reasons, but like, you know, behaving badly in like a male coded way is like one of the things I'm most afraid of in myself, right? I don't ever want to be the kind of person who hurt me, you know, and I'm terrified of that. But it seems like, you know, for whatever reason, I don't have as much of an ability to deny that things are real just because they're unflattering, right? So like that, you know,
Same.
like
Yeah.
yeah, like I just don't have this like so when something like really terrifying or threatening to my self conception arises, the response is just like, oh gosh, I need to pay a lot of attention to this to figure out exactly what's going on here, and to, you know, to try to make sure that I'm not doing that anymore. Whereas for a lot of people, it just seems to be denial, you know.
Right. They just yeah, they don't wanna look inward, and they don't wanna think about that because 'cause they're trying to escape their sex a lot of times when transitioning.
Yeah, yeah. Which again, you know, I can completely relate to, but like it seems better to like, even if that's your goal and that's what you want to pursue, it seems like the you know, sort of mature, healthy attitude would be to actually try to do that rather than to insist that you already have, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, to say, like, I'm earnestly working towards that, but it's always like a work in progress.
Right, exactly. You know, like I really, really wish that there's that fantastic Anne Lawrence quote, and it, you know, where she says essentially, right, like I think that, you know, if we appear and comport ourselves as women, we, you know, sort of gain the right to use that word, but we should always be the first to acknowledge that our womanhood is atypical, right? And she goes on to just describe like the kind of humility that could make integration actually possible for this population, right? As a separate issue, I think that like a lot of people are transitioning. It's not just that people are doing this badly; it's that, you know, a pretty large number of these people are, their lives are probably not best served by transitioning at all. But like, given that there is a population of people where this is the utility maximizing course of action for them, we definitely need a different playbook that's based a lot more on learning and humility and a lot less on entitlement. But unfortunately, the, you know, the prevalence of comorbid psychological issues makes the population that we're trying to reach resistant to a lot of these ideas.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to population to work with in terms of interpersonally. Is I would not have chosen this to be the thing that, like, I got super interested in, you know,
Yeah,
it happened to be. But,
yeah, 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 yeah.
um, I like, you mentioned you started sort of questioning, um, the mainstream trans narrative, or at least, like, maybe you're like, the fact that you were transitioning once you started seeing sort of sex typical behavior among your trans peers. Was that was that alone what led you to transition, or, like, what other things that you went through, um, impacted your decision to detransition?
Yeah, so that was all sort of like floating around in my mind, and an increasing source of like dissonance and tension. And then I took on I remember, it's easy to remember because it was the last day of the year, but on December 31st, 2022, I took a very heavy dose of psilocybin mushrooms, and this all just sort of came crumbling down for me, right? I
What
was
was
just
the
like,
dose, if you
uh,
remember?
I don't know exactly. I mean, I didn't weigh it.
Okay,
It was just like a baggie, but like I've done
okay.
mushrooms. a lot of times, and these felt very potent. But I basically just sat in a dark room and just typed all my thoughts out into my phone, and I was just like, nobody cares what's real, right? Like, no, like people are so much more concerned about about like social reality than like actual reality, and like that is a giant disaster, right? And it was very broad, right? It sort of reached out to encompass like general political themes, but it was centered around this issue because this is what I was thinking about a lot of the time. And so that was like kind of a very sharp inflection point in my thinking about all these things. And it sort of, it enabled me to get past certain pieces of psychological resistance and for everything to sort of gel. And like I came down from that experience and went to sleep. And then the next day I was scrolling Reddit, just sort of as a habit. And I noticed that I had just reflexively clicked like on some piece of like anti J.K. Rowling stuff. And then I realized as I did that, right, I went back and I unliked it. And I was like, I never actually read her essay, right? I just let people tell me how
Yeah.
horrible it was, right? They're just like, it's terrible. Don't read it. She's the worst. She's like Giga
Whenever
Hitler,
people say it to me, I ask them if they've read what she said, and I have yet
Yeah.
to have someone say yes.
Yeah, no, exactly, right. And I just read it, right? I went on her website and I read the letter, and I was like, I agree with pretty much every single word of this, right? Like this is, and I just everything was changing for me then because this was so much a part of my social community, right? My relationship, even, right? This was a foundational sort of tribal norm. And if I were a less disagreeable person, that might have been enough to sort of keep me in the fold. But I'm not, and I never have been. I cut my teeth being disagreeable, being like an angry, aggressive atheist in Oklahoma, right? Very, very Christian area. And so like it was the grooves of like pushing against the ambient norms were carved pretty deep into me. And once I was like, I just don't believe in this stuff, right? Then that I just sort of accepted the tension that caused. And like it, I don't want to pretend this was the only factor, but that together with other things eventually did lead to the breakup of my second marriage. And but yeah, the whole time, luckily I I have statistical training, right? Like my degrees are in math and physics, and I uh, I worked as an actuary for a little, which requires a decent amount of stats knowledge. And all of this is enough, with a little additional reading to read a lot of papers in the social sciences, right? Because the only really
Yeah, they're
technical
not
parts of them.
complicated.
No, the only technical parts are the stats, right? So, I could
Yeah.
read not just the abstracts, but I could like dig through the method section and stuff. And so I just really started voraciously consuming the available literature on like what do the MRI studies actually show, right? It's like, oh, you control for sexuality and like it goes, any cross sex shift in transsexuals goes away. And I was like, okay, that makes sense, right? Because like if your theory of homosexuality is itself kind of cross sex shift, right? Is that like gay men, orientationally gay men are, sort of female shifted in a lot of ways, not just neurologically, but physiologically. We see it show up in crime data, education data, all kinds of things, right? And so, if that's all that is, then like, what does it mean to be like a trans lesbian, right? It's like, oh, so you're like a male brain trapped in a male body, right? And it's like, okay, right? Like, and I was like,
Yeah.
I just like, I just started reading more and more of these things. And I would say that the first thing I let go of was the identity, right? I told people like, I don't care what you call me, right? I'm a male person who's done this thing. I've had these sets of experiences. These are the things that I think I do understand about the female experience as a result of being perceived as female for a while, right? And these are the things I obviously don't understand, but I don't care how people categorize me in their head, right? That was the first step for me. But I kept taking hormones. I was, I kept doing my makeup. I was very happy with my appearance, and I continued that way for a while through some pretty dark periods of my life after that second marriage fell apart. And then eventually, what led me to stop hormones was that I decided that I wanted to at least try to have kids. I understood that, you know, that might be irrecoverable at that point, but I wanted to at least give it a try. And then, you know, once I stopped hormone therapy and, you know, was sort of on my natural hormones again, didn't care about the identity stuff, hadn't cared about that for like a year. Eventually, I just got tired. You know, it was tiring to feel like I was sort of trying to lie to people every time I left my house. You know, I was trying to, you know, under an expansive definition of lie, right? Like I was trying to create the impression in the impressions in the minds of other people that were false, right? I was trying to convince people that I was female, and like it wasn't really like so much like a Kantian or an ethical thing or something. It was just exhausting, right? It was exhausting having to think that much about what other people are thinking about me, and like constantly like worrying about like tiny little aspects of my presentation. It's just a lot, you know? And so you know, I didn't really have that much of a choice when I had my implants, because that interfered with, you know, trying to pass as male too,
Yeah.
which is like a really frustrating state of affairs, right? Like I can't just like be a person out in the world. I'm weird no matter what I do, right? And so like I either have to like meticulously curate this illusion of myself as female, or I have to wear like real big baggy shirts even when it's hot, you know? So I had my it's funny, I kind of had a little bit of the FTM experience there, but yeah, you know, I had my implants removed, and I just over time, I couldn't be bothered more and more often. And then I was like, yeah, I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy again. So that was sort of the process there. It was not like there was no moment of like, you know, sort of emotional renunciation or something. It's just aspects of this drifted away over time.
Right. And it sounds like that mushroom trip also kind of accelerated things in terms of you centered your new foundation of your worldview on the fact that like basically objective truth exists and it is paramount. And then there was things downstream of that.
Yeah, definitely. That's, you know, that's always something that like I thought of as an essential part of me, and it really feels deeply innate because it goes back to when I was very very young. You know, I remember
I feel
when I was
similarly too.
like, yeah, like when I was 8 or 9, right, I would lie awake in bed wrestling over like the concept of free will, you know, and like I wanted to believe in it, but I couldn't, because I couldn't make it make sense to myself, right? And like this idea that like it really matters. And then, you know, the same thing manifested in my sort of new atheist phase, right? I don't really consider that to be an accurate label for me anymore, but the tendency is, you know, a constant thread throughout this, which is that like, look, because you hear all the same things, right? When you criticize, or at least you used to, it's pretty normal to do this now, but especially back in the aughts, you know, you would hear all the same things about criticizing religion that you get thrown at you when you criticize like gender ideology, right? And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it fits a lot of the definitions of a religion. But yeah, people just they rarely will dispute the facts that you say, right? Like a few people will. There's a few weird spurgs on the other side too, who dedicate their time to counter apologetics and making elaborate arguments and stuff. But mostly people just tell you you're mean, right? They're just like, that hurts people's feelings. That's really mean. You're an ex-phobe or whatever, you know, like, and that, you know, it was a very old recognizable pattern to me that like, that doesn't count, you know? And this, but I kind of
it's
drifted
irrelevant.
Right. That doesn't count as a response to what I said. I don't have to answer that because it's a non sequitur. And also, like, if we are going to talk about how people feel, right? Like, indulging nonsense ideas create systems that will hurt people a lot, right? That's why it matters. It's like if you have an inaccurate map of the world, you're going to bump into stuff all the time, and that will affect how you feel, right? In ways that are
Yeah.
far more dire than just having, cherished ideas dismantled or something, right? Like people will be physically hurt and are physically hurt because of wrong ideas, right? And so yeah, that's something that's always been like a very deep, important part of me. But I've kind of drifted away from that really, cherished aspect of myself, I think, both for, political and cultural reasons, and to get along with my group, but also, to flatter my own self-conception, right? And this was a moment when I just sort of re-rooted in like this basic part of me, right? Which is that the physical reality exists, right? The world, again, if I'm I think about the world in scientific terms, right? I'm a physicalist. I don't think that there's any ectoplasm, pushing around atoms out in the world or something, right? So like at bottom, everything is, sort of objectively describable in principle. Things are certain ways and they are not other ways. And getting this right matters, right? Like all of life is a navigation problem, and it's never better to have a less accurate map, right? And it can cause like really huge amounts of damage, both on an individual and a societal level, when people abandon this principle and they privilege other concerns over the truth. So yeah, that was a kind of a religious experience for me.
Yeah. And so you just kept gradually doing less and less gender transition stuff until I it sounded like I know you did an interview with Boyce a while
Mm-hmm.
ago. Like you were at a point there where you had like gone off estrogen and you were on testosterone, right?
No, I sometimes I'll say like on testosterone. What I mean is just on my natural hormones, right? I never
Okay, yeah, I
actually,
didn't know if you had
yeah,
had Orky. Okay.
yeah, no, I never took any exogenous testosterone. It seems to have, I'm like sweaty and stinky again. It's all, it's come back. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How was the like which way was easier in terms of like the mind fuck of the identity switch? Was it easier to transition or to detransition?
There were definitely some moments in detransition when I legitimately like forgot what I was, right? Or what I was doing, right? Like I was like, what did I start as? Like what thing am I? Right? Just like little brief moments, but it was still, like a few seconds, but it was still really funny. But yeah, I would definitely say in terms of stress level, detransitioning was way easier because again, like I didn't feel like I was trying to get away with something anymore. And like because I'm just being what I actually am, even like at some points in that process, people would actually like misgender me the other way. They would she her me when I wasn't trying to present that way at all. And but I didn't have to care about that in the same way that I had to care when I got misgendered when I was transitioning, right? Because when you're
Right.
transitioning and you get misgendered, this means you're doing it wrong, right? People aren't seeing you as in
Yeah, you're
accordance with this
failing.
deep, yeah, exactly, this deep important thing. Whereas like when I detransitioned, like it's funny sometimes like people on Twitter, I'm a face account on Twitter, and sometimes people will still like mistake me for FTM or a lesbian or something, and like it's just funny, right? It doesn't have any of the sting that it had in the other direction, right? It's just like that's a funny thing, right?
Right. Yeah, this is security in being male because it's just true.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's just like, well,
Yeah.
I am, so like that's the thing is that like the female identity was really based on people going along with it, right? It's like it exists to the extent that there's like a consensus that this is true. It really is like a socially constructed reality, whereas my maleness is a physical reality, and so like nobody's perceptions can be a threat to that in the same way.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Trans identity is like socially constructed in a very real way.
Yeah, no, in a real people just it's really a shame that people just throw that term around as sort of an argument stopper, because when you actually dig into what it means, it's a useful concept, right? Like a lot of things are socially constructed, and like the original social constructivist arguments about transsexuality are not totally invalid, right? Which is that like a not all, right? Anyone who would say all is obviously an ideologue, but like a lot of aspects of like the typical female experience are based on people perceiving you as female rather than because they can't access your sex except by perceiving you, and those things line up 99.9% of the time. Even very very few trans people pass, really actually pass, but like but if you do, right, and or to the extent that you do is maybe a smoother way of saying it, right, you do experience some of that social reality, but it is always based on perception, right? Whereas like my maleness is, just a describable, measurable fact about my body.
Yeah. So did you not? So you detransition and you stopped E for some period of time. Was that to like bank sperm or like just to see how it went?
So I haven't banked any. I'm still off of it. No, I just that might have been the thought initially. It was like I'll go off for long enough to save that and then go back on. But once I went off, and once I sort of stopped presenting as female, it was just a lot more comfortable. And I was just like, yeah, no, I'll just stick with this.
Right. And I would have to imagine that as a detransitioner, like from experience that like with transition, like you've already done that. Whereas like someone that hasn't transitioned yet, there's kind of like a grass is greener thing, but like you've stood on that other grass, and so you know what awaits you on the other side of transition. And so, does that make it easier to be detransitioned that you had already had a period of passing and basically had the typical trans experience?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think maybe if I hadn't done that, I would always be more curious about it, right? I'd be like, oh, maybe I'm missing something, exactly like you say, the grass is greener thing. But like, I like, I kind of really feel like I maxed out the experience, right? I think I did it pretty well, and like I did it to the fullest. I had a lot of, yeah, this is not to be immodest, but like, I had a lot of experiences, very, confirming, gender affirming experiences that I think a lot of trans people sort of want and don't get. And I really went all the way with that. And yeah, it's because of that, because I know exactly what that's like. I can sort of be at peace with being male in a way that maybe I couldn't have if I didn't do it. Unless it turns out that I am permanently infertile, I don't have any regrets about any part of this experience, right? It was incredibly valuable. So many detransitioners, and to be fair, if I had bottom surgery, I would probably feel this way too, but a lot of detransitioners seem to feel really like dark, victimized feelings about their transition. And again, I understand that in a lot of cases, this is because they have irreversible physiological side effects, and they have my deepest sympathy for that. But that's just not my experience personally, right? Is that like, I feel like this was a really fascinating learning experience. It makes me more interesting at parties. I have like all kinds of fun things I can talk about. I can pull up old pictures on my phone and be like, I used to look like this. Look at this. This is isn't that a funny thing, right? So yeah, all in all, I'm not sad that I explored that, and it really let me, yeah, put those nagging feelings to rest in a way. Like my like what I now understand is dysphoria is much lighter now, and really like almost completely within my control, right? I can just choose how to use my attention. I can understand where this comes from, right? I'm like, this comes from my gynephilia. It comes from my attraction, my physical and romantic attraction to women, and just understanding that, right? Just seeing it uh, really did more for my dysphoria than even what I would consider to be a fairly successful transition did. I thought it's just because of how it encourages you to hyperfixate, right? Like I thought so much more about my appearance, and I subjectively experienced so much more dysphoria at the height of my transition than I do now. But it was necessary to go through that process for me to get there, I think.
Yeah. And I'm glad to hear that, yeah, understanding how the condition worked removes some of the sting of dysphoria. I've experienced that too. Whereas when I didn't know what was going on, it really bothered me. But then once
Mm-hmm.
I knew that it was kind of just like a quirky, like brain miswiring thing, it, it's like it's easier to not take the feelings seriously or to not even really experience those feelings intensely in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You know, it when you don't know what these are or where they come from, right? You look at yourself and you're like, well, that doesn't look good to me, right? Like I don't look, and then but when you understand, it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
because you like women, right? And you're just but it's you don't have to be attracted to yourself, right? That's not like a necessary like condition to be okay and be happy and like live a life. You don't have to think that you yourself is hot, right? You can just
Right.
like try to look good, but you know that's it's not the end of the world if you're not your own sexual object. And like it's just so it was just yeah, I mean maybe I did have to go through all that, but just that itself, the recognition does so much for me to alleviate this, to the point that you know I don't really consider myself to have dysphoria anymore. Nothing like what I felt in the past, right? Just the crushing hatred of myself, really my whole self, you know, that stemmed from dysphoria, that stemmed from not being female, has largely been alleviated because I get it now, right? It's like, you know, we all like, maybe this is a little esoteric, but you know, like what a self is kind of is just like a little unit of computation in your head, right? It's a little self-representing unit of computation. And, you know, we don't only have one self in our heads, right? We also build models of other people, right? Where we're trying to, you know, sort of create a little simulation of their self, right? And once I understood that it's like, okay, I have a mental model of women, right? Both specifically, you know, individual women, but also like the category of women, right? And I have this model in my head and I mistook that thing for me, right? I mistook that for myself. And like, I felt like I was supposed to be attracted to myself and that I couldn't distinguish between that feeling and just liking myself as a person. And just seeing it was enough to like disentangle those things and to just be like, okay, that's what's happening here is that like I'm just mixing up these two different strange loops in my head and I can just not do that. And it's depressingly easy to just not do that. And it's like, wow, why are we telling people this, right? Like there's such a, you know, stigma against the kind of therapy that I really think could, even if people want to still transition, I think this is useful, right? It's still useful
Right.
to just
Yeah.
know what's happening. It's again, it's always better to have a more accurate map, right? Not just at a broad scale, but for the individual, right? And just like learning what is going on and how to manipulate your attention in order to modulate different feelings is so useful. But that's conversion therapy, so can't do it, you know.
Right. Yeah. How did you come across learning about autogynephilia? Because I remember you mentioning reading papers on, like, say, like brain sex. What did you run into Blanchard's papers around this time?
I think you know, I vaguely encountered the concept, but in like such a, you know, derisive framing that I didn't, you know, I didn't dive super deep into it. No, that didn't happen until I got on X, formerly Twitter, and you know, for not just that, but for general reasons, you know, I was sort of going through a broad uh, worldview reorientation at the time, and but I was still, you know, presenting as female, so I ended up in this little corner of Twitter that was like heterodox people who either are trans or talk and think a lot about trans experiences, and then that's where I encountered it, right? I think maybe the first time I really, you know, dove deep into the concept and started taking it seriously. And, you know, I think she should get a lot of credit for leading the way on this was when Gammy came out as AGP, right? And she was just like, I'm, you know, because she was like the ultimate like true trans, like
Right.
HSTS, like, and she was like, no, I'm actually AGP. This describes my experience better. And I was like, this is fascinating. Right. And then I did actually go through and, read, Blanchard's work, the original studies, the follow-up work that's been done. I actually, on my old account, I had the privilege of interacting with, a lot of people who do the work in this field, right? I interacted with Bailey, I interacted with Kevin Sue, uh, and you, right? And then I put all these things together. It matched, the reading I had already done on the sort of neurology and the sociological correlates of these things. And I was like, there was a little period where I was like, oh, what is, like, but pretty quickly after learning about it and learning what it was and seeing it and, presented as something other than like a slur,
Right. Yeah.
see that was really important, right? Like seeing AGP as something that someone might conceivably apply to themselves, not just like a mean thing that's, thrown at people. I was like, yeah, no, this definitely describes my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember when I think when I first like suggested to you that like you might be of autogynephilic ideology, I think you were like hesitant. I think you were still in like the questioning phase. But
Yeah, yeah.
considering your penchant for truth, I was kind of just like it was a waiting game. I'm like, I know the truth is gonna win out here.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I just had to get over the like the stigma issue, but I got there
Yeah.
in the end. I think that the main thing was that like when I very first encountered the two type model, I wanted to sort of fit it onto my own internal division of like male to females who act right and ones that don't, and that was the source of my hesitation. Was I was like, I think there are two types of these things. Here's a model that says there are two types and these are the same thing, but they're really not, right? Like they're many far fewer, but there are HSTS who behave in sort of an obnoxious, entitled way, and there are AGPs who integrate very well. So it's just those aren't exactly the same categories. And once I sort of understood that, I was like, yeah, this is what I am.
Right. Like once the categories weren't based on like who's acting right, like from a moral perspective, and instead based on like the psychology of the condition, it's like it's a different calculation, because it leaves out the whole moral aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that like again, this is it's a shame how moralized the entire conversation on trans issues is on both sides, because it really prevents understanding, right? Like so much of and again, these are feelings I really relate to, right? I completely understand a deep uh, discomfort about like feelings of like male boundary transgression or encroachment or whatever, right? I really get, I to the to a degree that I think not a ton of men do, why a lot of like gender critical women have those feelings and why those feelings are extremely intense, but the way that it causes them to conduct themselves on this issue is often just strategically not helpful. Like I get why you're scared, but like uh, furiously moralizing about the issue is just not going to get you where you want to go, right? It often leads them to uh, make bad maps, right? So like they essentially use AGP to mean like trans woman we don't like, right? So in so many
Right.
GC
Yeah.
in so many GC spaces, right? Like there are two kinds of trans people, right? There are poor, sad, little victimized autistic gay boys, right? And then there
Yeah.
are the evil AGPs who are all 55 years old and married and hugely fat and ugly and like they wear fishnets out in public, right? And like these are the two types of people. You have the sad victims and the evil predator people, right? And that is just like again, like that is not going to help this conversation become more fact-based, and it's not going to help steer anyone away So, like, some people should be steered away from transition because I don't think it's optimal for a lot of the people who are doing it. And like, that's not going to help, right? Like, that is, nobody's going to identify with this like evil caricature that they've created. And if people can't see themselves in these models, then they can't be helped by them, you know?
Yeah. And it is kind of like an own goal for for the gender criticals to just completely, by demonizing the concept of autogynephilia such that no one wants to identify as it, it just it stops you from getting into the realm of the real and the scientific, and just stays in that moralizing playground of like grievance. And I don't think it's gonna help them win. I mean, I personally I don't really, I'm not gonna shed any tears if they don't win, because like, they haven't been the nicest to me. But um I I think it's poor strategy on their part. It's a complete lack of strategy and more of just an emotional reaction. And but I don't like it because I want more autogynephiles to know that they're autogynephilic, but not necessarily feel bad about it, but just to like know what's real. Because I kind of have this naive hope that if more people believe true things, then there will be less transition regrets, and also more um, better behavior, like conduct among trans people, if they understand that the acceptance of their gender identity is to some extent conditional on good behavior.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Across the board, it would be a huge improvement for everybody, right? Like, people who are not going to be best served by transition would be more likely to be able to avoid it and to find other ways of processing these feelings. People who are like, autogynephiles who do decide they want to transition will not be able to play this weird word game where they're like, well, I'm a woman, and so everything I do is female behavior or whatever, right? Like, when you understand, it's like, no, this is like a thing that you're doing. It's not really is so much as like transition, like being an autogynephile is something that you are, but transition is something that you do, right? It's not, that is not innate, right? It's a set of actions that you take, and like,
Right.
you can
But then you
take them.
become a transsexual.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. But like, just to understand that, like, this is a process, right? It's like transitioning. Transition is a verb, right? And that, like, you actually have to do it, right? And not just like physically, but behaviorally, right? It's an immigration process, and you should really put effort into assimilating and naturalizing as like a member of the sex class that you want to immigrate towards. And I really think that, like, there is a way to do this well, right? Like, I had a lot of experiences that were of really kind of touching acceptance when I was transitioned, right? So like, at one point, I I had left the mental hospital, and I was going to stay in like transitional housing, and the people at the mental hospital only gave me like the phone numbers for like women's housing. And I brought this up. I was like, hey, do you think this could be a problem, right? Do you have any like mixed housing or like what? And they're just like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that. Give it a just try, right? And so like, I went to one of these houses, and I met this group of women who were all, like me, trying to sort of put our lives back together after various, problems and struggles. And none of them had any experience with trans people. None of them were, like, super like woke or political or, like, saturated in any of this language. This was all like basically totally new to them. And I think that it was exactly because I wasn't entitled that they ended up, voting to allow me to stay there. I was very open at every step. I was like, look, I get that this is unusual, and like, if it will make anybody at all, I literally didn't have anywhere to stay at the time, right? I would have been sleeping in my car if they said no, but I was still like, no, like, if this is going to make anyone the slightest bit uncomfortable, I don't want to do that, right? I'm here because this is where the people at the center told me to go. But the last thing I want to do is impose myself on anybody. And I think that if there was more of that attitude, then the people who do want to transition would actually get to experience, some of the community that they want so badly, right? But it's just this, it's like a Chinese finger trap situation, right? Where like the more they use just like brute force to try to get what they want, right? The more they try to
Yeah.
bully and shame and blackmail and legislate people into accepting them, the less they'll ever actually be accepted, And I just, this applies in so many areas of life, right? Like the more you try to force it, the less you're going to get it. The tighter you squeeze your fists, the more star systems slip through your fingers. But yeah, and that, I think that belligerence comes from this need to insist on the identity, right? And so I think if people could understand what they were doing, they would at least have a better chance of sort of reaching the enlightenment of humility.
Right. Yeah. I think that would be a better outcome. And like that's not to say I don't like I don't think transsexuals should necessarily have to like beat themselves up for being transsexual, but just like
No.
be realistic about like the shortcomings of what is possible and being gracious that when people do go along with it that they're doing so and just not taking it for granted.
Yeah, just like be humble and be real. I think the thing that this is another thing I experienced a lot, and it made me so sad that this is what we've done to the culture in this way. But so many people in lots of different contexts were terrified of offending me, right? They would have to do all this like elaborate throat clearing and apologizing before they would ask me like really basic questions, right? That, obviously anybody would want to know. And they're just like, I'm so sorry. I don't know. I just don't know I'm very ignorant. I know I should just read. And I'm like, guys, calm
Just
down.
talk to me.
Yeah, you're so stressed out. And I'm like, I know you're like that because like, so many of us are so touchy, right? And are so just snap at everything, right? It's like a wounded animal, right? That just snaps at every hand that comes close. And it really, really does not serve the community well to be that way. And you could just see when I was just like loose and normal and easygoing and like not too fussed about stuff, you could just see this tension fall out of people. And they're just like, oh, okay, I can like relate to you like a person. I don't have to treat you like a delicate crystal vase that's in danger of toppling over at any moment, right? That's like, nobody likes to be around that, right? And you're going to end up even more isolated, and you're going to feel that distance from everyone in your life if you behave that way. I mean, it's a shame,
Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that that has come to happen, that people are wary of interacting with like the gender weirdos, so to speak, like the gender variant crowd. Like I've had plenty of people, cautiously ask me my pronouns and stuff, and I'm just like, don't worry about it. I don't care. And they have trouble
Mm-hmm.
believing when I say I don't care. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
seriously, I don't care. I want you to just like interact with me. Use whatever pronoun. Just like let's actually interact. I don't care about the gender stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And that, again, that was the very first thing that I let go of, and the most freeing thing to let go of in my sort of long, gradual detransition process was I was just like, I don't care about these labels, right? I am what I am, right? Like I'm a physical object, right? I'm this, right? And like that thing is not dependent on what it is labeled.
Right. Exactly. Um, how has I've seen you posting recently about falling in love. How has that impacted um your gender feelings, so to speak?
Yeah. So, I think that again, even before this, I think I had managed and reduced my dysphoria a lot. But being in like a really deeply fulfilling and connected relationship, sort of maybe like wiped away whatever remaining residue of dysphoria there was, because my uh, my affinity for women now has like a very clear and very fulfilling target, right? Like this model in my head is not me. It exists to make me a better partner for this person that I love, right? That it exists to help me understand and empathize with the women, and one particular woman who is deeply important to me, right? And that's the home of this mental model that exists, and it feels like a much more stable, for me, a much more stable and satisfying expression of my gynephilia, right? Is to externalize it and experience it in the context of a partner, rather than trying to sort of be my own closed loop and be
Yeah.
both the desirer and the desired, right? I can I have somewhere to put these feelings now, and yeah, so it's made me much more comfortable with maleness. And even I would say that, like, I've experienced some things that you could sort of term like male gender euphoria, right? Like, I really like fulfilling this role, right? I like feeling protective, right? I like feeling yeah, this sort of just like caring love for a woman. It's really satisfying, and I like when I'm good at it, right? I like being a good partner. I like being a good, fiance, a good boyfriend. I look forward to being, the very best husband I possibly can. So yeah, I think that I've never been more not just okay with, but happy to be male than I am in this moment in my life.
Yeah. Have you have you had any concern about whether, because like the autogynephilia like competition thing, like with the conventional heterosexuality, are you concerned that like in a year or two or whatever that it'll start like impairing your ability to connect?
I don't think so. So my like, if I ever like wanted to like cross dress at home or something, like that wouldn't be a problem in my relationship. But these, now that like I understand what these feelings are, and that I don't have to ruminate them all the time, right? I think that it'll just be like a very fleeting thing, right? An activity rather than an identity, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah. Have you um discussed with your partner, like, have you told her what autogynephilia is?
Yeah, yeah. She actually read your book.
Oh, cool.
Oh,
Yeah.
you cut out there for a second.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I
I was glad to hear that she read the book.
Yeah, yeah, she found it super, super helpful. She, had been exposed, obviously to trans issues just through the ambient culture, and you know, uh, she said she felt like her understanding was massively improved by reading the book, and also that it made her, she's someone who, I mean, frankly, like me, is in many ways, critical of a lot of aspects of the movement and the sort of ideology it's built on. But she said it gave her a lot more understanding and empathy, and of what these kinds of people are going through. So you did us both a big favor there.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I just that's what I hope, like, when people read it that it helps them feel like they understand reality better, and then if they're AGP, that they don't feel, like, bad about themselves afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a very compassionate book. I mean, it's mostly just factual, but you can
Yeah.
feel the care and the lack of any kind of hostility. So yeah, that definitely came through for her, and she thought it was very interesting, as a purely intellectual topic also. So
Right. Yeah. And once you see it, you can't unsee it in terms of, like, the trans movement. Like, once you can spot the 2 types, it's like it's so easy.
yeah, Yeah, no, it's like that. There's this thing that happens when you play video games, where if there's like a repeated object, like a coin that always looks exactly the same or something, then like it just lights up in your mind when you see it, right? Your brain just
Yeah.
snaps right to that, and it's like it's the same thing with this, right? Like once you see it, then like you just like it glows out of people, and you're just like that's what you are,
Yeah. And it's where I live, there's just so many gender variant people, whether they're transitioned or not. And it's just all over the place. There's AGPs everywhere.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. Um
Where do you live? If I don't know if you don't want to say that
yeah.
on the stream.
Oh, I live in Portland.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
actually. I'll talk to you about that off the stream. But yeah.
All right. Yeah. Um yeah, is there anything else about your story or your thoughts that you want to tell any autogynephiles or autoandrophiles listening before we end recording?
Yeah, I would say like be gentle with yourself. You know, I don't. And really, that goes not just for this issue, but in general. But if you're hurting, right, don't make it worse by taking a really aggressive, almost abusive attitude towards yourself. Don't run from the truth, but also don't use it to cut yourself. Like just sit with these feelings, accept these feelings, accept what they are, and try to find love in yourself for the person that you really are, not the person that you might want to be, not the person that you try to see yourself as, but really just do a rigorously honest and ideally informed self inventory, and just calmly and compassionately sit with that person. And then from that place of compassion and softness towards yourself, figure out what steps are best for you. And don't let anyone else tell you what those are.
All right. Yep, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for being willing to record this and come on my channel, Hunter.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a blast. Good to talk to you as always.